Hey y'all, Casey here. The world seems to be opening up slowly, and I don't know about y'all, but I know I am super thankful for it. I'm sure the pandemic has been hard on folks in different ways, with some people getting affected more than others, but I would wager to guess that all of us have been affected in some substantial way by it. I know for me at least, it's been really rough. It's led to a lot of changes in my life, some for the better, and others not so much. It has reshaped the world and changed some of my long-held opinions. In particular, it's been especially rough on my mental health. As I've said before, I come from a background of political organizing. I've worked for a bunch of different organizations on different progressive causes. My North Star in life was always trying to make the world a better place than when I came into it. One of the hardest things about the past year and a half for me has been that foundation, those convictions being shaken and to some extent changed. At the start of the whole thing, I took on the role of doing most of the felony arraignments for Multnomah County. For those who don't know, arraignments are the first appearance in court for anyone who is charged with a crime. They are where you get an attorney assigned to you, where a release argument can be made if the defendant is in custody, and where you get your future court dates, among other things. Arraignments were one of the things that never truly went digital or telephonic. I tried to conduct one morning's worth of arraignments over the phone, and in my opinion, I was unable to provide adequate representation for my clients. There was no way to have a private conversation with your client when you're conducting the hearing telephonically, because your client who is in custody is in a glass box and your voice just gets pumped into the courtroom on a loudspeaker. So everybody hears what you're saying, and in order to answer you or ask you questions, your client has to holler across the entire courtroom to a mic that hopefully picks up what they're saying. But half the time, I couldn't hear them asking me questions or even just saying that they understood what I said. Since I didn't feel like making the already farcical process of arraignments even more like Franz Kafka's The Trial, I conducted arraignments in person for 3 days a week for a majority of the pandemic. The courtroom that arraignments are held in Multnomah County is a building called the Justice Center, which is located in downtown Portland. They are held there because the rest of the building that's not the courtrooms is one of 2 jails in Multnomah County. So when it is time for defendants who are in custody to come to court, they can just bring them downstairs. Doing that many arraignments under normal circumstances would be trying, which I know because I used to do misdemeanor arraignments for a part of the week in the before times. But doing arraignments that often during the pandemic when so much was uncertain was extra tough. Then came the riots. My first interaction with the rioters was on the first day when they tried to block me from going into the courthouse to do my arraignment shift. As in, they were preventing me from going into the courthouse where I would be arguing for the release of all my in-custody clients. I thought that was absurd and I wasn't going to take it, so I pushed right past them, went in the courthouse, and did my job. I believe it was later that night that the rioters set the Justice Center on fire. Remember how I said the Justice Center is mostly a jail? Yeah, so the rioters set the jail on fire with all those people locked up inside. Thank goodness that fire got put out, otherwise they might have killed a bunch of people. During the ensuing months, lots and lots of tear gas was used around the Justice Center. The tear gas continuously seeped its way into the jails, where defendants were locked in their cells in the middle of the night, with nowhere to go, trapped in a cloud of CS gas. On some days, arraignments was moved to the other courthouse because the Justice Center was too smoky, to filled with CS gas, or there was broken glass everywhere because the rioters smashed a bunch of windows the night before. Some days when the rioters were particularly zealous into the early morning hours, I got a mouthful of CS gas on my way to court. The rioters set up tent cities in the parks in between the two courthouses. The parks I had to walk through to get to court. They also set up a camp right across from the entrance to the Justice Center. When I would walk through the parks and enter the Justice Center, the rioters were frequently hostile towards me. Their hostility would manifest in different forms, but included physically assaulting me and calling me tranny this, faggot that, public pretender, and so on. There was plenty of catcalling, which, when I would ignore them, would sometimes escalate to them saying things like, "Hey, don't ignore me, you dumb bitch!" Again, I was the one going into court to argue for release for their buddies, but that didn't seem to matter to them. After the first few days of riots, downtown Portland looked like a war zone. There were fences and barricades, riot cops patrolling, more broken windows than I've ever seen in my entire life, burned out cars, destroyed parks, holes in the pavement from mortars being used by rioters and riot weapons used by cops. There was garbage and debris everywhere. They even smashed the front door of our office, the public defender's office. The havoc abounded in my neighborhood as well, even all the way across the river. The rioters and protesters would march past my place every night, which at first I didn't mind too much, but after months of it and my already frayed nerves, my inability to get away from it really started to get to me. I am well aware that not everyone who was out in the streets was a rioter, by the way. I know lots of people who went to the protests. Protesters and rioters are different, not only in my parlance, but legally speaking. Protesters weren't the ones who were beating passersby to within an inch of their lives. Protesters weren't the ones committing arson against my clients. I've heard people say that there was nothing but peaceful protests, and that is absurd. Equally absurd, though, is what I've heard other people say, which is that there were nothing but violent protesters. Tons of people were just out there doing what they thought was right and not harming anybody. I also want to make it clear that I am anti anybody who harms the community that I live in, not just rioters. I've been to a fair share of protests myself. I have seen and experienced cops doing absolutely horrendous things. I've been shot with rubber bullets that have left me with welts for weeks when I was trying to act as a neutral, legal observer. I've had a cop shove the barrel of a grenade launcher in my face from about a foot away, and that is all to say nothing of all of the police harassment that myself, my friends, and my clients have experienced outside of protests. This is all to say that things are complicated. Almost nothing is ever as simple as all of these people are good and all of these people are bad. As if Portland wasn't feeling post-apocalyptic enough, then came the fires. The city looked like it had become Silent Hill. There was ash and smoke everywhere, and the sky looked like twilight pretty much no matter what time of day it was. I ended up breaking out my Israeli military surplus gas mask in order to continue to conduct arraignments in person every day during this time. As tough as dealing with the fires was to some extent, I actually welcomed them because during the fires, the rioting stopped, which was a massive relief. I haven't even mentioned one of the most infuriating things that I experienced while I was doing arraignments during that time. One day I was putting together a release argument for someone who had been arrested the night before rioting. One of my standard questions for people when I'm building a release argument is, where do you live? When I'm asking that question, what I'm really asking is, do you have stable housing or are you homeless? And the reason I ask that is because if someone is not homeless, they are much more likely to be released from custody. When I asked this individual where they lived, this individual didn't give me an address or tell me that they were sleeping on the streets. Instead, this person told me that they lived in Florida. I think I just sort of stared at this person for a while in disbelief, while they then told me that they had heard about what was going on in Portland and wanted to take part. I ended up handling the arraignments of several other out-of-towner rioters, and I know there were plenty more because I only saw the ones that got arrested and charged with felonies. The idea that people would flock to the city I loved, the city I called home, to come and destroy it was infuriating to me. I wasn't the only trans person that got assaulted by these rioters, by the way. Some guys who were part of BLM's security assaulted a trans woman who was downtown at night in the part of downtown the rioters decided was theirs. She was lucky though because she didn't get it near as bad as their next victim, who they beat so bad he had to go to the ER. Again, seemingly for no apparent reason other than he was downtown at night in the part of downtown they decided was theirs. I finally got out of arraignments and was put on civil commitments instead. A civil commitment is essentially a mini trial that happens the day after the defense attorney gets assigned to the case, where the state is alleging that my client is mentally unfit and needs to be committed to a mental health institution against their will. If found to be what essentially amounts to guilty, the defendant can be held in the hospital for up to half a year and their Second Amendment rights can be taken away. So, needless to say, it was a high-stakes, high-stress caseload. On some days, I would do 3 of these mini trials a day, which was insane. By the end of it, I went insane. Although I'm making light of it now, it was no joke. I was very mentally ill. All of that trauma resulted in me taking a month off of work because I was too cuckoo to function in polite society. Do you know what it's like to try to find a psychologist in the middle of a mental breakdown, which is itself in the middle of a pandemic? It's not just hard, it's impossible. I finally had to go to mental health urgent care. I came very close to becoming my own client. Once I was able to think straight again, I had to reevaluate my life and make some tough decisions. One of those tough decisions was leaving my dream job. Another one was me prioritizing my mental health over basically everything else, which meant me cutting myself off from the social world with only a tiny handful of exceptions. In short, the toll of the pandemic on my mental health was severe. I'm much more stable now, but I feel that the repercussions will be long-lasting. I've essentially lost my ability to socialize. I was already pretty introverted, but now my ability to socialize is at an extreme low. Reliving all this is honestly really hard for me. I hate having to explain it to people again and again. So my hope is that after making this video, I won't have to explain it 9 million more times. It's difficult for me to be around nearly anyone who is still connected in some way to my old job, because it brings up all that trauma that I spend the rest of my time trying not to think about. I love all those people dearly, which makes it especially hard. I'm sure I've annoyed or upset at least some of them, and that pains me because they were never anything but wonderful to me. But for right now, it's just too hard. The pandemic has had a profound and lasting impact on me, just like it has for, I'm sure, many others. I hope that in time we are able to heal, but for now, the wounds are still so raw. Crowds and movements betrayed me repeatedly. And not just any crowds or movements, but specifically crowds and movements that I used to see as allies. My main priority in life was to help the world, and the world turned around and spat in my face. In some instances, literally. I lost faith in a lot of things I used to put stock in. My values and what I care about have changed. I don't know exactly where I stand politically these days. Mostly, I feel politically without a home. If pressed, though, I think my politics at this moment could best be summed up as I want to get gay married and protect my marijuana plants with my guns. The pandemic has not been all bad. It's given me plenty of introspection time. It's also given me plenty of time to do one of my favorite things, which is to read. I've spent lots of good times with my friends Mr. Nabokov, Miss Plath, Mr. Kerouac, and Miss Wolfe. I've made some memories with the love of my life that I would not trade for the world. I've learned things about myself, about the world, and about how I relate to the world. For all of those things, I am very thankful. I wanted to end on that note because I am making this video to commemorate this moment in time from my point of view, and I don't want to create the illusion that it was just one catastrophe after another. Nothing is ever that black and white. There were wonderful things, and there were terrible things. This is a record of my experience living through a moment that I never would have anticipated. I'd love to hear other people's stories too. If you're feeling brave and inspired, maybe leave a little snippet down in the comments below. I know I'd appreciate it. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you got something out of this video, please click that like button and subscribe. Until next time.